What if the man who seemed to have everything, wealth, power, respect, was haunted by the one thing he could never have? Alexander Grant built an empire from glass and steel, but behind the polished image lived a man shattered by betrayal. Years ago, the woman he once loved exposed his most intimate wound before the world, his struggle with infertility. Humiliated, Alex buried his heart beneath work, vowing never to love again. But fate has a way of breaking through the walls we build. One evening at a glittering gala, his path crossed with Clara Bennett, a young curator whose vision wove technology and art into something breathtaking. She saw not the broken tycoon, but the man beneath the scars. Could she heal wounds no one else dared touch? Or would she, too, prove that love is nothing more than illusion for a man like him? As whispers of the past return and shadows threaten their fragile connection, Alex must face the question that terrifies him most. Is he worthy of love? Even when the world says he's incomplete, stay with us through this unforgettable journey of heartbreak, resilience, and redemption. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss a single chapter of this story. The city of Denver spread out like a glowing constellation beneath the evening sky. From the top floor of Grant Technologies' headquarters, Alexander Grant stood alone, hands in the pockets of his tailored suit, gazing at the sunset through walls of glass that kept the world both near and impossibly far. The Rockies loomed in the distance, their peaks painted in gold and violet by the fading light. Closer in, traffic on the highways pulsed in red and white streams. Ordinary lives in motion. Alexander took it all, in the way a man might stare at a painting in a museum, admiring the colors but never feeling part of the scene. At 38, he had achieved what many would consider the pinnacle of success. He was the founder and CEO of Grant Technologies, a company that revolutionized clean energy systems. His name appeared in Forbes, his face on the covers of business journals, his ideas quoted in conferences from New York to Silicon Valley. The fortune he had built was staggering. Yet, as he leaned against the cool glass, watching the city descend into night, a single truth pressed on him like the weight of a mountain. All of it felt hollow. His office reflected the same contradiction. Sleek leather chairs, a walnut desk that gleamed like polished stone, abstract paintings chosen by decorators, shelves lined with awards. Everything carefully curated to project order, power, brilliance. But there was no warmth here, not a family photograph, not a trace of laughter echoing in these high ceilings. The only personal item rested inside a locked drawer, a small velvet box, unopened for years, gathering dust. He had bought the ring for Victoria Hale. The name still stung. Even after nearly a decade, her memory had the power to tighten his chest, to remind him of the evening when his heart had been not merely broken, but publicly humiliated. She had been dazzling, with her sharp wit and ambition, the perfect match in the eyes of society. Together, they had looked like a golden couple destined to rule Denver's high circles, until the night she decided his deepest wound would make the best cocktail hour joke. He tried not to think about it now. He told himself the past was past. But whenever the light faded, when the quiet grew too heavy, the words would return, slicing through him all over again. "What good is marrying a man who can't give me children?" she had laughed. "All the money in the world, but nothing to carry on his name." Those whispers had spread like wildfire through Denver's elite. Suddenly, the powerful young visionary was also the defective one. A man whose billions couldn't buy him the one thing people assumed mattered most. That was the night Alexander began to build his empire higher and colder than before. Each new success became another brick in the walls he erected around his heart. By the time he turned 38, he had everything except the one thing he had once dreamed of: a family. A partner who loved him, not for his fortune, but for who he was when the lights went out. Behind him, his phone buzzed on the desk. He didn't move to answer. It would be Maggie Collins, his secretary of nearly 10 years, reminding him about the foundation's dinner schedule or the stack of contracts awaiting his signature. Maggie meant well, always did. She was sharp, loyal, the only one he trusted in this building. Yet even she had stopped trying to talk to him about anything beyond business. She knew where the invisible fences were. Everyone did. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, still thick though streaked with silver at the temples. He caught his own reflection in the window, broad-shouldered, immaculately dressed, the picture of composure. Yet he saw the hollowness in his own eyes. He was a man who could command markets, negotiate billion-dollar deals, charm senators, and still feel utterly alone when the city lights came on. Outside, the last sliver of sun slipped below the mountains. The office lights dimmed automatically, leaving him in the half-glow of evening. Somewhere below, families were sitting down to dinner, children were laughing, lovers were holding hands along the riverwalk. Ordinary joys, everyday miracles. Alexander pressed his forehead against the glass, eyes closed. He told himself he had made peace with this solitude, that he didn't need what had been denied to him. Yet a quiet voice within whispered that peace was only another word for surrender. When the intercom finally crackled to life, Maggie's voice came through, calm but tinged with hesitation. "Mr. Grant, the museum's gala invitation is still on your desk. They're asking for confirmation. Should I decline on your behalf?" Alexander's lips curved into a faint smile, though it held no humor. Another gala, another evening of hollow smiles and shallow conversations. He opened his eyes, looking again at the glowing city. "Decline," he started to say. Then, after a pause, he added, "No, wait. Tell them I'll consider it." There was silence on the line, then Maggie's gentle reply, "Yes, sir." He straightened from the glass and returned to his desk. His hand lingered on the velvet box in the drawer. Though he did not open it, not tonight. But as he sat down, a strange thought passed through him, quiet as a breeze slipping through the cracks in his walls. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to go. He dismissed it quickly, shaking his head. He was Alexander Grant, after all. He didn't believe in second chances. And yet, a restlessness had settled into his chest, the kind that comes not from work left undone, but from a future that refuses to stay buried. Memory has a way of sneaking back into the quietest hours. For Alexander Grant, it often arrived with the clink of ice in a glass, or the hush of evening settling over the city. It came not as a gentle echo, but as a sharp replay of the night everything had collapsed. He had been 30, already celebrated as a prodigy of energy innovation. Investors adored him. The media praised his brilliance, and by his side stood Victoria Hale, a woman the world believed was his perfect match. She was stunning, with the kind of beauty that seemed to stop conversations when she entered a room. More than that, she carried herself with the poise of someone who knew she belonged at the center of every spotlight. At first, Alexander had been drawn to her fire. She was clever, ambitious, and relentless in her pursuit of social prominence. With Victoria, every evening glittered with possibility dinners with senators, charity galas, mountain getaways where photographers just happened to be waiting. She made him feel like part of a world beyond equations and blueprints, a world of elegance and admiration. He believed naively that she loved him in return. That belief shattered one warm summer night at a garden party hosted at the Hale family estate, just outside Denver. The manicured lawns glowed under lantern light. Champagne glasses caught the sparkle of chandeliers strung from white tents. Music floated through the air, mingling with the hum of laughter and the rustle of silk gowns. It should have been a night of celebration. Their engagement had just been announced, and the city's elite had gathered to toast the couple who, in everyone's eyes, represented the future of Denver society. Alexander remembered approaching a group of guests, drawn by the sound of Victoria's laughter. Her voice was unmistakable bright, confident, carrying easily over the chatter. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but he arrived just in time to hear her words. "Can you imagine," Victoria said, swirling her champagne, "all that money, all that genius, and he can't even give me children." The circle of society women gasped, then leaned closer, hungry for scandal. Victoria's smile sharpened as she went on. The doctor said his chances are practically non-existent. Low counts, low motility, sterile. If we're being plain, he offered to drag me through treatments, needles, endless procedures. But why would I waste years of my life for the hope of one fragile child? A ripple of laughter moved through the group, muffled behind jeweled fingers and polite attempts at sympathy. Alexander froze. The world seemed to tilt beneath him. Only weeks earlier, he had confided in Victoria about the medical tests and intimacy he had never shared with anyone else. He had believed she would guard his vulnerability. Instead, she wielded it like a weapon, something to polish her wit at a garden party. The words struck deeper than any business rival's attack could have. They cut at the heart of his identity, the man he thought he was, the future he had imagined. He remembered the taste of metal in his mouth, the way his vision blurred as if the lanterns had flared too bright. Around him, the crowd continued to chatter, unaware that the ground had just cracked beneath his feet. When Victoria finally noticed him standing there, her smile faltered. For a heartbeat, her eyes widened, then narrowed into something like annoyance, as though he were the one intruding, not she. "Alex," she said smoothly, recovering her composure. "Darling, I didn't see you there." He said nothing, could say nothing. The betrayal was too raw, too sharp. He left the party without a word, the engagement ring still heavy in his pocket. By the next morning, the gossip had spread. Denver's circles of wealth and power thrive on whispers, and this one was irresistible. The brilliant young millionaire who could power entire cities but not his own lineage. Some whispered with pity, others with thinly veiled mockery. Headlines didn't name it outright, but the insinuations were clear enough. Alexander learned quickly how people looked at him now, some with sympathetic smiles that felt like daggers, some with cruel amusement they barely tried to hide. Every room he entered seemed to fall quiet. Every conversation seemed to turn as he approached. It was not just humiliation. It was annihilation of trust. The ring he had bought for Victoria never left its box. He locked it away, along with the man he had been, the man who had once believed in promises and futures. From that wreckage, Alexander made a vow. If he could not be whole in the eyes of others, he would become untouchable. He would silence pity with power, drown whispers in achievement. He buried himself in his company, working 70-hour weeks, building Grant Technologies into a titan of industry. And he succeeded. Every new contract, every groundbreaking innovation, every skyscraper lit by his systems became proof that he was not the broken man Victoria had painted. His triumphs became armor, each accolade another wall against the shame. But armor has weight, and walls, no matter how high, do not heal. Late at night, when the city grew quiet, the memory would return. The laughter under the lanterns, the sting of betrayal, the knowledge that the empire he had built, every shining building, every gleaming headline was forged from those shattered pieces of his heart. Grant Technologies was, in truth, less a monument to brilliance than it was a fortress against humiliation. It was his way of proving, not to the world, but to himself, that he was still a man of worth. And yet, even as he told himself that work was enough, a hollow ache lived beneath the surface. He could silence the gossip, he could conquer markets, but he could not erase the echo of Victoria's voice. All that money, and he can't even give me children. The wound remained, unhealed, unforgotten. And though Alexander would never admit it aloud, that wound was the reason the walls of glass around him sometimes felt less like windows and more like prison bars. Morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander Grant's office, painting long streaks of gold across polished mahogany. The city below bustled with energy commuters rushing to work, delivery trucks weaving through narrow streets, children with backpacks hurrying toward school buses. From 40 stories up, the world looked orderly, predictable. Inside, however, the air carried tension. Alexander sat at his desk, scrolling through financial reports, though his eyes kept drifting from the numbers to the glass skyline. He had already conquered most of what men in his position desired: a sprawling penthouse, a fleet of cars he never drove, recognition in business journals, even a wing at the children's hospital that bore his name. And yet, each morning arrived with the same sense of repetition, as if his life were a loop of meetings, figures, and sleepless nights. The sharp click of heels broke the silence. Margaret Collins Maggie, as everyone affectionately called her, entered carrying a slim, cream-colored envelope. She had worked by his side for nearly 6 years, the kind of secretary who was far more than her title suggested. Efficient, yes, but also fiercely loyal. Where others saw only Alexander's unshakable exterior, Maggie had glimpsed the man beneath the one who sometimes lingered too long at the window, staring not at the city, but through it. She placed the envelope carefully on his desk. "Another invitation," she said, her voice even, though her eyes carried the hint of insistence. Alexander sighed. "Put it with the others. This one's different." He glanced up, eyebrows arched. "They always are, according to you." Maggie didn't flinch. Instead, she tapped the envelope lightly, as though the gesture might awaken his curiosity. The City Museum, annual Gala. They're unveiling a new program combining art and technology to expand access for underprivileged schools. They want Grant Technologies as the lead sponsor, and they want you there. He leaned back, arms crossed. "We already fund their programs through the foundation. Write the check, send the flowers, move on. No need for me to endure another evening of polite chatter and half-hearted compliments." Alexander, Maggie rarely used his full name, and when she did, it meant she wasn't going to let the matter drop. She held his gaze with quiet determination. "This isn't about writing another check. It's about what you stand for. You've built something remarkable. But if the only story people ever tell is about the dollars you make, then what will remain after you're gone?" He looked at her, caught off guard. Maggie had always respected boundaries, rarely offering personal counsel. But there was something in her tone now, gentle, almost maternal, that pierced the armor he wore. "Legacy," she continued softly. "It's not just about money, sir. It's about what you leave behind for those who never knew your name. This gala, it's not charity. It's a statement." He turned back to the window, jaw tightening. Legacy. The word landed heavily. He had spent years proving himself, building walls of glass and steel around the wound Victoria had left. Yet walls, he knew, did not last forever. Someday even Grant Technologies would be another chapter in a history book. What then? Would people remember the man who turned betrayal into brilliance, or would they remember nothing at all? He rose slowly, walking to the credenza where the velvet ring box still rested in its locked drawer. He did not open it, he never did, but his hand lingered near the drawer handle, a silent reminder of the ghost that still followed him. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of its usual certainty. "You really believe it matters if I show up, one man in a tuxedo, shaking hands, posing for photographs?" Maggie stepped closer. "Yes, because people still believe in stories. Mr. Grant, and whether you like it or not, you are one. If you don't tell it yourself, others will tell it for you, and you may not like the version they choose." Silence hung between them. The only sound was the faint hum of the city's morning traffic drifting in from below. At last, Alexander exhaled, a sound more weary than reluctant. "Fine. I'll attend. But make no mistake, Maggie, this is nothing more than an obligation, a performance. Don't expect me to enjoy it." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Obligation or not, sir. I think you'll find the evening less predictable than you imagine." He narrowed his eyes. "You sound unusually certain." "Let's just say," she replied, gathering her notepad, "I've learned that life has a way of surprising even the most careful men." As she turned to leave, Alexander looked once more at the city below. Somewhere out there, strangers went about their lives unaware of his battles, his triumphs, his wounds. Perhaps Maggie was right. Perhaps legacy required more than profits and patents. Still, he told himself, the gala was nothing more than another box to check, another line in a schedule, and yet, as he straightened his tie and returned to his desk, a small, uninvited thought flickered through his mind, one he quickly shoved aside. What if she was right? What if this night became something more? For now. Alexander forced the question away. In his heart, he carried only resignation. A gala was just another stage, and he had grown tired of performing. But fate, patient and unyielding, had already begun its quiet work. The city museum gleamed like a cathedral of glass that evening, every pane reflecting the shimmer of chandeliers within. Limousines lined the curb, valets in crisp uniforms guiding guests into the grand atrium. The sound of an orchestra drifted into the night air, violins and cellos weaving a tapestry of elegance that seemed to lift the very air around the building. Inside, the gala unfolded in a swirl of crystal and silk. Tables were draped in ivory linen, each crowned with towering arrangements of white lilies and roses. Light spilled from chandeliers, casting prisms across gowns stitched with sequins and tuxedos pressed to perfection. The air carried the faint scent of perfume and polished wood, mingling with the clink of champagne flutes raised in endless toasts. For Denver's elite, it was the event of the year, a place where business deals were whispered over canapes, and appearances mattered more than sincerity. Yet tonight, something felt different, as though the museum itself had taken a deep breath, waiting for a story to unfold within its walls. And then Alexander Grant arrived. He stepped from the sleek black sedan with the composure of a man accustomed to cameras, though he despised them. His tailored tuxedo fit with quiet precision, not ostentatious but commanding. His dark hair, touched at the temples with silver, caught the light in a way that seemed almost sculpted. The moment he crossed the marble threshold, heads turned, conversations faltered, some watched with admiration, others with envy, but all acknowledged his presence. To the outside world, Alexander was the embodiment of control, a man who carried both fortune and gravitas with ease. Only those closest to him, Maggie, perhaps knew the cost of that composure. He accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, though he had no intention of drinking it. In truth, it was armor, a prop to occupy his hand and shield him from the suffocating small talk he knew would follow. As he moved through the atrium, polite greetings rose around him. Mr. Grant, what an honor. Alexander, so glad you could join us. He nodded, offering the practiced smile that never quite reached his eyes. Each step echoed faintly on the marble floor, a reminder of how alone he felt even in the midst of a crowd. The evening's exhibits surrounded the guests like silent sentinels, paintings infused with digital overlays, sculptures that shifted under projected light, installations that hummed softly with coded algorithms. The theme was Where Art Meets Innovation, a blending of tradition and technology that had drawn curiosity across the city. He might have passed it all by, had his gaze not caught on a woman near the center of the gallery. Clara Bennett. She stood slightly apart from the clusters of patrons, speaking animatedly to a small group of young artists. Her gown, a deep shade of emerald green, shimmered as she gestured with her hands. Her auburn hair was swept into a loose chignon, a few curls escaping to frame her face. But it was not the elegance of her attire that drew Alexander's attention. It was her eyes, bright, alive. They seemed to reflect not the chandeliers above, but some inner fire. She listened as much as she spoke, nodding, smiling, leaning close when one of the artists whispered something shyly. There was no pretense, no calculated charm, only sincerity, flowing from her like light. For a moment, Alexander found himself rooted, his practiced detachment slipping. Something stirred in him, something he could not name. He had seen countless faces at countless galas, each masking ambition behind polite smiles. But Clara's expression was different. It was unguarded, genuine, untouched by the games of status that consumed these rooms. When her gaze lifted, their eyes met, the crowd blurred, the music softened. For Alexander, time seemed to pause. There was no spark of recognition. She likely knew him only as the figure behind the company name emblazoned on the evening's program. Yet her look held no judgment, no expectation, only curiosity, and something within him shifted. He inclined his head slightly, a reflex born of courtesy. She smiled, not the rehearsed curve of lips society women offered him, but a real smile, warm and disarming. It unsettled him more than any cold remark ever had. Maggie's words from the morning returned unbidden legacy. It's about what you leave behind. He told himself it was coincidence, just another introduction at just another event. Yet even as he tried to turn away, his eyes found her again, drawn as if by a quiet gravity. A board member soon intercepted him, launching into a rehearsed pitch about the museum's future projects. Alexander nodded at the appropriate moments, but his attention wavered. From the corner of his vision, he saw Clara moving gracefully among patrons, guiding them through the installations, explaining how a sculpture responded to brainwave signals, how a digital canvas shifted its imagery with the motion of a viewer's hand. She spoke not to impress, but to share wonder, and the people around her responded not with the strained laughter Alexander knew too well, but with genuine fascination. When the orchestra swelled into a new movement, he realized his grip on the champagne flute had tightened. He set it down, uncharacteristically restless. What was it about her? Why, in a sea of glittering strangers, did one woman's glance unravel the careful walls he had built? Alexander straightened his shoulders, reminding himself who he was, the man who transformed betrayal into an empire, the man who needed nothing from anyone. Yet, beneath the polished surface, a quiet truth pressed forward in Clara Bennett's unguarded gaze. He had glimpsed something he had not felt in years. Not admiration, not ambition, but sincerity. And for reasons he could not explain, it left him unsteady. The heart of the museum glowed with a softer light now. Guests drifted through the galleries, their conversations a gentle murmur beneath the sweep of strings from the orchestra. Alexander Grant moved slowly, politely acknowledging those who greeted him, but always keeping his responses brief. His mind, though he would not admit it aloud, lingered on the woman in emerald. He found her again in the north wing, where a small crowd had gathered around an unusual installation. A cascade of glass strands descended from the ceiling, each filament alive with shifting color, sapphire melting into gold, crimson dissolving into violet. The sculpture seemed to breathe, its patterns never repeating, always evolving. The effect was hypnotic, like standing inside a living aurora. And at its center stood Clara Bennett. She wasn't lecturing, as many curators did when presenting a work. She was telling a story. Her hands moved with graceful certainty, and her voice carried warmth that seemed to draw people closer rather than hold them at a distance. This piece is called Resonance, she explained. It's programmed to respond to the sound in the room, the rise and fall of voices, the echo of footsteps, even the music we hear faintly in the background. Every movement, every breath we take, changes the pattern. A man in the front asked if it was meant to symbolize chaos. Clara shook her head, smiling. Not chaos, resilience. The artist designed it after recovering from a devastating accident. She said the strands represented the fractures in her life, but the light represented what she chose to do with them, that even broken things can carry beauty. That hope lives beyond brokenness. Alexander's breath caught not audibly, but enough that he felt it in the tightening of his chest. Hope beyond brokenness. The phrase slid under his defenses like water through stone. For years, he had accepted that brokenness defined him, that his empire was built not despite the wound, but because of it. But here, in the voice of a stranger, came another possibility that brokenness was not the end, only a beginning. He stepped closer without realizing, until he stood among the small group encircling her. Clara noticed him then. Her eyes met his with a quiet steadiness, and for the second time that evening, he felt the disarming weight of sincerity. "Mr. Grant," she said, her tone respectful but free of the flattery he so often heard. I was hoping you'd see this installation. The museum is grateful for your company's support. Without it, we couldn't share works like this with the public." He inclined his head. "It's remarkable." "Remarkable," she teased lightly, though without malice. "That's the engineer in you speaking." He raised an eyebrow. "And what should I say instead? That it speaks to you, that it unsettles you, that it makes you wonder." Her smile softened. That's what art does, when it's doing its job. The people around them chuckled quietly, charmed by her candor. Alexander, however, found himself caught between irritation and intrigue. Few dared to prod him. Fewer still left him without a ready defense. "You assume much about me," he said evenly. "Perhaps," she allowed, her gaze never wavering. "But sometimes assumptions open doors to conversations that matter." The words hung between them, and for the first time in years, Alexander did not retreat. Instead, he asked, "And what do you think this?" He gestured toward the glowing strand says to you. Clara turned slightly, her profile lit by the sculpture's shifting hues. "That we are more than what breaks us. That beauty isn't the absence of fracture, but the light that finds its way through it." The crowd slowly dispersed, drawn toward the next installation. Yet Alexander remained, anchored by something he couldn't explain. They began to walk together, side by side through the gallery. She pointed out other works, an oil painting embedded with subtle motion sensors, a sculpture that responded to touch by altering its texture. Each time, Clara spoke less about technique and more about meaning. She spoke of art as conversation, as healing, as invitation. And Alexander listened, truly listened. He realized he had not done so in years. His exchanges with most people were transactions, calculated and controlled. But with Clara, there was no performance, only presence. He found himself asking questions about her work, about the artists, about the way technology could give shape to emotions words could not hold. Her answers carried not just knowledge, but passion. As if she believed in the very marrow of her bones that art could mend the fractures of the world. The more she spoke, the more something long dormant stirred within him. And yet, even as it stirred, he tightened his hold on the walls he'd built. He could not afford to forget what trust it cost him. So when Clara's laughter lingered in the air between them, when her hand brushed lightly against his sleeve as she gestured toward another exhibit, Alexander forced himself to retreat inward. He reminded himself that sincerity could be a mask, that warmth could conceal ambition, that he could not be so easily drawn in again. By the time they circled back toward the main hall, he had convinced himself of his distance. Or so he thought. Clara paused near a quieter corridor. She hesitated for a moment, then turned to him. "Mr. Grant, if you have time later this week, I'd love to show you something not yet ready for public display. My studio is just down the hall where we test experimental installations. I think you might find it different." He studied her, searching for the angle, the hidden calculation, yet all he saw was earnestness. "I don't usually make casual visits," he replied. "It wouldn't be casual," she said quickly, though her smile softened the words. "It would be a chance to see what happens before the lights and champagne. The raw work, sometimes that's where the real truth lives." For reasons he could not name, he heard himself say, "Perhaps." Clara nodded once, as though that single word were promise enough. Then she was gone, summoned by another patron seeking her guidance. Alexander stood alone for a long moment, the glow of resonance still flickering at the edges of his vision. He told himself it was nothing. A polite invitation, a trivial moment in an evening already too long. But, in the quiet of his mind, another voice whispered what he refused to say aloud. He wanted to see her again. The museum had long since quieted. The echo of music, the clinking of glasses, the laughter of Denver's elite. All of it had faded into memory as the last of the guests departed. Beyond the galleries, the private wings of the building felt like another world, dimly lit and hushed, corridors lined with locked doors. Clara Bennett walked ahead, her emerald gown whispering softly against the polished floor. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in these back halls, but also with a touch of excitement, as though she were letting Alexander Grant into a secret place. "Most patrons never see this side of the museum," she said, glancing back at him. "It's where the experiments happen, the unfinished things, the ideas too raw for display." Alexander followed, his stride measured. Part of him wanted to turn back, to leave the evening at polite conversation and a safe farewell. Yet another part restless. Curious urged him forward. He told himself it was only interest in innovation, in the merging of technology with art. Nothing more. They stopped at a heavy door. Clara produced a key card. The lock clicked, and she pushed it open. The room beyond was larger than he expected, more workshop than gallery. Work tables were scattered with wires, headsets, notebooks scrawled with sketches, half-finished sculptures leaned against walls, their forms both beautiful and strange, and in the center stood a structure that seemed alive. It rose like a column of glass threads, suspended from a circular frame. Tiny sensors glittered among the strands, faintly pulsing as though waiting. "This is my current obsession," Clara said, her voice warm with pride. "It's called Aurora Mind. It responds to neural signals, the electrical rhythms of thought itself. You wear the headset, and the strands translate your brainwaves into light." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "So, the mind becomes an artist in a way," she said, stepping closer to the column. "It doesn't create a picture so much as reveal patterns, emotions, focus, even fragments of memory. Each person produces something different. No two displays are ever the same." She gestured toward the headset resting on a nearby pedestal. "Would you like to try?" He hesitated. His life had been lived behind walls of power, walls of privacy. The idea of exposing even a flicker of what lay beneath made him uneasy. But Clara's eyes held no pressure, only invitation. And something in him, weary of restraint, yielded. He lifted the headset, its silver band cool against his fingers, and settled it over his temples. The column of glass threads stirred. At first, the light was faint, a flicker of pale blue, the glow of distant stars. Then, with sudden force, color erupted. Crimson flared into gold, violet into radiant white. The strands pulsed like a heartbeat, cascading with patterns so vivid the entire room seemed drenched in living fire. Clara gasped softly. "I've never seen it respond like this." Alexander gripped the pedestal, unsettled. The light was too bright, too alive, as though it were not only responding to his mind, but revealing something he himself could not control. "Is it supposed to do that?" he asked, his voice tight. "No," Clara whispered, eyes wide with wonder. "It's extraordinary." She stepped closer, circling the column, her expression lit by the colors. "The sensors are reading levels I didn't think possible. It's like your thoughts are amplifying the entire system." He felt exposed, as if the lights were laying bare the turmoil he spent years concealing, the fracture, the ambition, the loneliness, all translated into a spectacle of fire and color. "Enough," he said sharply, pulling the headset off. The lights dimmed instantly, fading back to their quiet pulse. Clara reached out, taking the headset from his hand. Her fingers brushed his, a fleeting touch, but enough to send a jolt through him. She looked up, her expression softening. "I'm sorry," she said gently. "I didn't mean to push." "You didn't." He replied too quickly. He took a step back, forcing space between them. His heartbeat, however, betrayed him fast, uneven. Clara tilted her head, studying him. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence carried a strange intimacy, fragile but undeniable. Then, practical as ever, she broke it. "Sometimes the art reveals more than we expect," she said, carefully placing the headset back on its stand. "That can be frightening, but it can also be healing." He forced a faint smile. "I'll take frightening over healing." She gave a small laugh, though her eyes held understanding. "Fair enough, still. Thank you for trusting me enough to try." Alexander said nothing. His gaze lingered on the column of glass threads, now dark and still, before turning back to Clara. She was standing close, so close he caught the faint scent of her perfume, something subtle, a blend of cedar and vanilla. For the briefest instant, he allowed himself to wonder, what would it be like to lower his walls, to let someone see not the empire, but the man? But the thought burned too dangerously. He stepped back abruptly, his composure snapping into place. "It's late," he said, his tone clipped. "I should go." Clara's smile faltered, just slightly, but she nodded. "Of course. Thank you for coming back here. I hope you'll visit again." He inclined his head, offering no promise. As he moved toward the door, the echo of her words followed him. Hope beyond brokenness, healing. Words that stirred something he did not want, stirred. Outside, the corridor was silent, the polished floors reflecting his retreating figure. "Don't be a fool again," he muttered under his breath, the words half command, half plea. But as he left the museum, the memory of radiant light and the warmth of Clara's touch refused to leave him. The week after the gala stretched longer than Alexander Grant expected. He told himself he was busy meetings with investors, deadlines for new patents, calls with lawmakers about clean energy legislation. His schedule overflowed, yet through the flurry of commitments, a quiet thread persisted, the memory of a column of glass threads igniting with impossible light, and the woman whose laughter lingered even after he had walked away. Clara Bennett. Try as he might. Her name surfaced in the quiet moments between phone calls, in the pause before he signed a contract, when he stood at his office window staring down at the city. She unsettled him, not with ambition or flattery, but with sincerity. And sincerity, he reminded himself, was the most dangerous thing of all. Maggie Collins noticed. She had always been observant, not merely of the emails and schedules that structured his life, but of the man behind the titles. And lately, she noticed small changes, the way his eyes lingered too long on nothing in particular, the faint distraction in his tone when she briefed him, the uncharacteristic silence that filled spaces where he once gave crisp answers. On Thursday morning, as she set a stack of reports on his desk, she allowed herself a gentle question. "You've seemed thoughtful this week, Mr. Grant?" He didn't look up from the papers. "I'm always thoughtful. Different kind of thoughtful." She pressed, her voice warm, unthreatening, not the kind about profits or patents. That drew his gaze. He studied her with the same intensity he gave to board members who challenged him. But Maggie wasn't intimidated. She had earned the right, through years of loyalty, to speak truths no one else dared. "Whatever it is," she continued, "it hasn't dimmed you. If anything, it's put a little light back in your eyes." Alexander leaned back, expression unreadable. "Careful, Maggie. People might think you're suggesting I have feelings." She smiled faintly. "I wouldn't dream of it, sir. Just saying sometimes walls can be useful, and sometimes they only keep the good things out." The words lingered after she left, threading through his thoughts like a melody he couldn't shake. That evening, at another charity function, smaller than the gala, held in a private hall near the river, he found himself face to face with Clara again. Not by design, or so he told himself, though some part of him suspected Maggie had nudged the invitation onto his calendar for that very reason. Clara was not alone. Beside her stood a man with sandy hair and an easy smile, his tuxedo worn with more casual grace than most in the room. He was in his mid-30s, with the kind of presence that drew people in without effort. "Alex," Clara said, her smile warming the air between them, "I'd like you to meet my friend Dr. Samuel Price. He's a pediatrician at St. Luke's Hospital. Samuel, this is Alexander Grant." Samuel extended his hand with genuine enthusiasm. "The Alexander Grant Clara's told me about you." Alexander shook his hand firmly. "Hopefully good things." Samuel's grin widened, mostly about light shows and stubborn silences. Clara rolled her eyes, laughing softly. "Don't listen to him." But Alexander noted the ease between them, the way Samuel teased her. the way Clara's laughter flowed in response. A flicker of something uncomfortable stirred in his chest, something he quickly named and dismissed jealousy. The evening unfolded with polite conversation, though Samuel had a way of steering it beyond the superficial. He spoke about his work with children, fragile newborns, cancer patients, kids who spent more time in hospital rooms than playgrounds. His stories were laced with both heartbreak and humor, revealing a man who carried sorrow lightly, not by ignoring it, but by shouldering it with grace. "You see a lot of brokenness in my field," Samuel said at one point, swirling his glass of water. "But kids, they have this gift. They don't stay broken. They bend, they heal, they find joy anyway. Sometimes I think they're the real teachers, not us." Clara nodded, her gaze soft. "That's why I love collaborating with him. Medicine and art both are about healing, in different languages." Alexander listened quietly. His instinct was to hold back, to remain the observer rather than the participant. Yet Samuel's words stirred something, echoing Clara's earlier talk of hope beyond brokenness. The phrase pressed again against the edges of his carefully guarded soul. When Samuel excused himself to greet another colleague, Clara turned to Alexander. Her expression was gentle, but her voice carried quiet insistence. "You don't have to stay behind your walls all the time. You know." He stiffened. "You assume I have walls." Her smile was faint, but steady. "Everyone does. The question is whether you're building a fortress or a prison." The words landed too close to truth. Alexander forced a chuckle, though it sounded hollow even to his own ears. "You speak as though you know me." "I don't," she admitted, "but I'd like to." He looked at her then, really looked at the openness in her eyes, the way she seemed to mean exactly what she said, and something within him ached, a longing so sharp it frightened him, because he did want to let her in, and because he was terrified of what it would cost him if he did. As the evening drew to a close, Alexander stood outside beneath the cool night air. The river shimmered under the city lights, flowing steady and unbothered. Clara's laughter still echoed in his mind, Samuel's words still pressed against his defenses, and Maggie's warning, "Sometimes walls only keep the good things out," refused to fade. He closed his eyes, the old vow rising like iron in his blood. "Don't be a fool again." But even as he repeated it, he felt the truth stirring beneath. Perhaps the greater foolishness was never risking at all. The evening was supposed to be routine, a benefit dinner for Denver's Children's Hospital, an event Alexander Grant had attended nearly every year since establishing his foundation. The hotel ballroom was opulent, lined with banners praising donors, filled with the scent of roasted meats and polished silver. Guests mingled under crystal chandeliers, laughter bubbling over the music of a jazz quartet. Alexander entered with the usual composure. His tuxedo was immaculate, his expression practiced. Maggie had arranged his schedule. Samuel was already in attendance as a guest of the hospital, and Clara had agreed to meet them there after introducing a new art therapy program for pediatric patients. It should have been another evening of appearances, another box to check, until she arrived, Victoria Hale. She swept into the room like she owned it, every inch the socialite she had always aspired to be. Her gown shimmered in champagne gold, her hair styled in flawless waves, her jewelry catching the light with calculated brilliance. People turned as she entered, just as they always had. She thrived on that attention. And then her eyes found him. Alexander. She purred, her smile sharp as glass. What a surprise. I didn't think charity dinners were still your style. His jaw tightened. Victoria. Her laughter tinkled, rehearsed and cutting. She stepped closer, ignoring the wary glances of those nearby who sensed the tension. "It's been, what, nearly a decade, and yet here you are, still alone, still trying to buy redemption with oversized donations." Her words slid through him like a blade. He felt the old wound tear open the humiliation of that summer night, the whispers that had chased him ever since. He kept his voice level. "I'm here to support the hospital. Nothing more." But Victoria was not finished. She leaned in, her tone dropping to a daggered whisper that carried just far enough for nearby ears. "Tell me, Alex, did they ever find a cure for your defect? Or are you still the man who can light cities but never his own home?" The air in the circle tightened. Conversations faltered. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, suddenly fascinated by their drinks. The cruelty of her words hung in the space, echoing too loudly. Alexander felt heat flood his chest. His composure wavered. For years, he had trained himself to absorb such barbs, to bury them under achievements and wealth. But tonight, in the center of the glittering ballroom, the fortress cracked. He opened his mouth, not even sure what would come out. Anger, denial, shame. And then Clara's voice cut through. "That's enough!" She stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, her emerald dress catching the light, her presence commanding in its quiet authority. The firmness in her tone silenced even the jazz quartet for a beat. All eyes turned to her. Clara's gaze locked on Victoria, unflinching. How extraordinary that a woman so devoted to appearances still believes cruelty passes for wit. You confuse weakness with strength. Ms. Hale? True strength is not in mocking scars, it's in carrying them with dignity. Victoria blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. No one in Denver society had ever spoken to her that way in public. Clara continued, her voice steady, each word precise. "If Alexander is remembered for anything tonight, it will be for the lives he's touched through his foundation, the children who have futures because of his work, not for the petty cruelty of someone desperate to make herself feel tall by cutting others down." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Heads nodded, someone clapped softly, then another, until the applause swelled, not raucous, but steady, supportive, undeniable. Alexander stood frozen, breath caught. He had never needed rescuing, never allowed anyone to shield him. For years, he had carried his shame like armor, insisting he needed no one. Yet here was Clara, standing before the crowd, taking the blow for him and turning it back with grace. Victoria's face flushed, though she tried to mask it with a smirk. "Well," she said, her voice tight, "it seems you found yourself quite the defender." Clara smiled faintly. "No, he doesn't need defending. He needs honesty, something you've never learned to value." The words landed like the final strike of a gavel. Victoria's composure cracked just enough for satisfaction to ripple through the onlookers. She muttered something under her breath and swept away. The glitter of her gown fading into the crowd. Silence lingered, charged and electric. Alexander turned to Clara, his throat tight, words failing him. For the first time in years, he felt not the burden of carrying the weight alone, but the unfamiliar, humbling sensation of being protected, not by power, not by money, but by someone's unyielding belief in him. He searched her eyes, finding not pity, but strength. And for the first time, the fortress around his heart trembled not from attack, but from the possibility of letting someone in. The benefit dinner finally wound down, the applause fading into the polite chatter of guests retrieving coats and waiting for cars. Alexander had shaken the necessary hands, offered the obligatory thanks, and made his way toward the exit with Clara beside him. Neither spoke much as they stepped into the crisp Colorado night. The city buzzed faintly behind them, but Clara suggested a walk before they went their separate ways. Instead of the waiting car, Alexander followed her, almost without thought, toward the Platte River, which wound quietly beneath the bridges just a few blocks away. The riverbank was lined with lampposts casting soft pools of light across the paved path. The water shimmered under the moon, its steady current carrying with it the whispers of the city. They walked in silence at first, the rhythm of footsteps on the stone path filling the space between them. Finally, Clara broke it. "You handled yourself with grace tonight," she said softly. "But I know words like hers don't just slide off. They leave marks." Alexander gave a faint, humorless laugh. "Marks. They carve me into what I am. Every deal, every expansion of Grant Technologies, it was all mortar in a wall built to keep people like her out." Clara slowed, turning her gaze toward the water. "Walls can keep pain out," she murmured, "but they also keep life from coming in." For a long moment, Alexander said nothing. He stared at the river, remembering the humiliation, the cruel laughter of Victoria's Circle all those years ago. She was the only one I trusted. He finally confessed. The only person I thought I could build a future with. And she turned my private struggle into her entertainment. Since then, I've lived with this shadow. I can conquer industries, but I couldn't conquer that betrayal. His voice cracked something he had not allowed in public for years. He swallowed hard, his breath uneven. Clara stopped walking, gently touching his arm. Alexander. The sound of his name from her lips made something inside him loosen. He looked at her, and to his surprise, his vision blurred, tears hot, unexpected slipped free. He turned away quickly, ashamed, but she didn't let him hide. "It's all right," she whispered. "You don't have to carry it alone tonight." Her words pierced through years of armor. For the first time since that night at Victoria's estate, Alexander allowed himself to break. His shoulders trembled as he let the grief surface, the shame, the loneliness, the relentless drive to prove himself to a world that still whispered behind his back. Clara didn't interrupt. She simply stayed beside him, steady and present, her hand resting gently against his sleeve. When he finally drew a ragged breath and managed to speak again, his voice was low, raw. "You don't know what it's like to build an empire out of broken pieces, always afraid someone will notice the cracks. I've lived my whole life proving I'm more than what I can't give. But in the quiet moments," he shook his head, "the silence is louder than any applause." Clara's eyes softened. She stepped closer, her tone steady but warm. "You're wrong. I do know something about it. Maybe not the same pain, but the same silence." He blinked at her, surprised. She turned toward the river, her profile etched against the silver light. "When I first started in the art world, I was dismissed at every turn. Too young, too inexperienced. I'd propose ideas for integrating technology, and older curators would smile politely before shutting the door in my face. I can't tell you how many nights I went home wondering if I should give up, wondering if my voice would ever matter." She looked back at him, her eyes glistening. "You learn to wear masks, to act confident even when you're crumbling inside, to fight twice as hard just to be heard once. I know what it means to feel invisible. Alexander. And I know how heavy that silence can be." Something shifted between them, like two wounds recognizing one another. The night air grew still, the river's murmur their only witness. Clara's hand tightened gently on his arm. "But here's the thing. Even broken glass can reflect the light. Maybe the cracks don't disappear. Maybe they never will. But sometimes, those very fractures let the light through in ways perfection never could." Alexander stared at her, the words wrapping around the ache inside him. Broken glass, light, hope. No one had ever spoken to him like that, not with pity, not with judgment, but with quiet conviction that brokenness didn't mean ruin. The walls inside him wavered. Without thinking, he reached for her hand. Their fingers laced together, tentative but sure. For a moment, neither spoke. They simply stood at the river's edge, bound by the silence they both understood too well. Then, slowly, Alexander lifted his other hand to her cheek, brushing a stray curl that had slipped from her updo. Clara's breath caught, but she didn't move away. The kiss was soft at first, almost hesitant, as though both were afraid to cross the threshold of friendship into something more fragile, more dangerous. But in that touch, in the press of her lips against his, there was something neither of them could deny. Not passion yet, but promise. When they pulled apart, Clara smiled faintly, her forehead still resting against his. "See, even the broken pieces can shine." Alexander exhaled, steadying himself. For the first time in years, he felt not just alive, but possible. The river flowed on, carrying the weight of their secrets into the night, while above them the stars flickered fractured light across a dark canvas. reminding them both that beauty often lived in the broken places. For years, Alexander Grant had lived a life defined by precision. His days were carved into schedules and spreadsheets. His nights spent in silence above the city, the glow of monitors his only companion. But in the weeks following that walk by the Platte River, a subtle shift began to take root. At first, it was small. Clara would send him an invitation to an exhibit opening, and instead of deleting it or passing it to Maggie to politely decline, he found himself saying yes. He told himself it was business, public relations, an image of the benevolent philanthropist who supported the arts. Yet each time he stepped into a gallery or museum, what he really sought was her. Clara moved through those spaces with a grace that had nothing to do with the gowns she wore or the titles on her resume. She lit up when she spoke about the young artists she mentored, or when she described how technology could create new ways of seeing beauty. Alexander found himself watching her more than the art, studying the way her hands moved when she grew excited, the way her eyes softened when she noticed a detail others had missed. Their relationship grew quietly, away from the cameras and the whispers of Denver's elite. They met for coffee in tucked-away cafes where the barista knew Clara by name, but never pressed for introductions. They walked in the botanical gardens at dusk, blending into the couples who strolled among the flowers. Sometimes, after particularly long days, Clara would come to his penthouse not for elaborate dinners or grand gestures, but to share takeout containers on the floor, laughing about spilled noodles or trading stories about the strangest patrons they had ever encountered. Alexander surprised himself with how much he talked. For years, he had locked away his thoughts, offering only polished remarks to investors and carefully chosen words to the press. With Clara, the words came easier. He told her about his childhood summers in the mountains, about the pressure of inheriting his father's business, about the nights when silence pressed too heavily against his chest. She, in turn, spoke of her mother's sacrifices, of the struggle to be taken seriously as a woman in a field ruled by old money and older men, of the dreams she held that went beyond any museum wall. One night, as they sat on his balcony watching the city lights shimmer like fallen stars, Clara asked him quietly, "What do you want?" "Alexander, not for the company, not for the public, for you." The question struck him harder than he expected. For years, his answers had been automatic growth, innovation, dominance in the market, but as he looked at her, at the gentle way her hair caught the glow of the skyline, the truth slipped out before he could stop it. "I want a family." The words felt dangerous, like stepping onto thin ice. He hadn't spoken them aloud in years, not since Victoria had turned his private dream into a public wound. Clara said nothing at first, only reached for his hand. The warmth of her fingers steadied him, but inside, his mind raced. Dare I dream again? That night, after Clara left, Alexander found himself staring at the reflection in his window. For the first time, the man looking back at him wasn't only the CEO, the fortress of steel and ambition. There was something softer in his eyes, something he had buried for so long he almost didn't recognize it. Still, fear lingered. At business meetings, when colleagues spoke of legacies and heirs, the old shame would return like a blade twisting in his side. Alone in bed, he would remember Victoria's laughter, the cruel way she had called him defective. The memory gnawed at him, whispering that he was unworthy of the very dream now flickering back to life. Yet Clara's presence kept pushing those shadows back. She never pressed, never demanded more than he could give. She simply lived with an authenticity he found disarming. When she spoke of hope beyond brokenness, she meant it not as a slogan, but as a truth she had carved from her own battles. They began to make small rituals of hope. Clara brought him sketchbooks, insisting that he try drawing even though his lines were stiff and uncertain. "It's not about the result," she teased. "It's about letting your hands speak when words won't." He countered by showing her the prototype labs at Grant Technologies, laughing when she gasped at the machines that looked more like science fiction than reality. The more time they spent together, the more Alexander began to imagine a life beyond survival. He pictured waking to Clara's laughter echoing through his penthouse, imagined tiny feet pattering across the polished floors. He pictured family dinners, not in boardrooms, but around a kitchen table cluttered with crayons and unfinished homework. The visions terrified him. Each time they rose, so did the voice in his head. Don't be a fool again. You know what you can't give. Don't set her up for disappointment. Don't set yourself up for ruin. But then Clara would smile at him, with that quiet certainty that made him believe in second chances. And for a fleeting moment, he would silence the voice and let himself dream. One evening, after an event where he had watched her captivate donors with her passion for merging art and technology, Alexander walked her to her car. She turned to him, her eyes bright even under the dim glow of the streetlights. "You're changing, you know," she said softly. "How so?" he asked, genuinely curious. "You're letting the light in." Her words lingered with him long after she drove away. That night, Alexander stood at his window again, but instead of only seeing the towers of glass and steel, he imagined what it might feel like to share it all with someone who saw past the empire and into the man himself. Dare I dream again? The question pulsed in his chest, fragile yet undeniable. For the first time in years, his answer was not silence, it was hope. Victoria Hale never did anything halfway. When she reappeared on Denver's social stage, it was not as a quiet returnee, but as a storm dressed in designer silk. The gala where she first reemerged had been only a preview. Now, she maneuvered with calculated cruelty, her words dripping into the ears of those eager for scandal. She only wants his money. Victoria murmured to a circle of society women at a luncheon, her tone sweet enough to mask the venom. You can see it in her eyes. That Bennett girl is clever, I'll give her that. But cleverness isn't love, not with Alexander Grant. The remark was whispered, then repeated, then printed. Within a week, headlines appeared in local magazines and gossip columns: art curator or gold digger, Clara Bennett's meteoric rise under Grant's shadow. Is the millionaire's heart a business transaction? The words crawled across screens, onto paper, into conversations. Alexander had no interest in overhearing, yet couldn't escape. Grant Technologies board members were discreet but tense. Optics matter, one of them warned. If Miss Bennett is using your name, the company could suffer by association. Maggie tried to shield him, carefully curating which articles landed on his desk. But even she couldn't stop the whispers from reaching him at events, at dinners, even from old acquaintances who suddenly felt the right to warn him. "She's too perfect," Alex, one longtime associate, said at a fundraiser. "Young, ambitious, with everything to gain. Don't you think it looks familiar?" The word familiar echoed, burrowing deep. Familiar, like Victoria, the past, already raw from their confrontation weeks earlier, pressed down on Alexander's chest like a weight. He told himself he knew Clara, her sincerity, her warmth, her uncalculated laughter when she spilled coffee or tripped over her own enthusiasm. But then he saw the headlines again, Victoria's smirk flashing in his mind, and doubt slithered in. What if it's true? What if I'm just the same fool again? Clara, for her part, had never courted attention. She continued her work, her passion undimmed, but the press followed her relentlessly now. Paparazzi appeared outside the museum, snapping pictures of her unlocking the door with a frown, twisting it into Grant's new flame scowls at staff. Her phone buzzed constantly with requests for comment. Most she ignored, though a few she answered firmly. "I'm a curator, not a celebrity. My work speaks for itself." But the worst blow came not from strangers, but from Alexander. One evening, when she stopped by his penthouse with a small box of pastries from a bakery she'd discovered, the doorman hesitated before letting her up. When she reached his floor, Alexander was waiting not with his usual guarded smile, but with a hardness she hadn't seen directed at her before. "Clara," he said quietly, "this isn't a good time." Her brows knit. "I just thought, after the week we've both had, you might want company." He shook his head, eyes flicking away. "I need space. For now." The words sliced deeper than any headline. Clara studied him, searching for the man who had bared his soul by the river, the man who had spoken of family and dreams. Instead, she saw someone retreating behind walls she thought they had begun to break together. "Alexander," she whispered, "please tell me you don't believe them." He opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence between them was louder than any accusation. Her throat tightened. She set the box of pastries on the table. Unopened. "I thought you knew me better than this." When she left, her heels echoed against the marble floor, each step a mix of hurt and dignity. Alexander stood frozen, staring at the unopened box, his chest hollow. For days afterward, he buried himself in work. Meetings stretched late into the night, documents piled high, and Maggie's concerned glances went unacknowledged. But even in the flurry of tasks, Clara's absence gnawed at him. He would glance at his phone, half expecting a message. None came. He told himself it was better this way. Better to end it now before disappointment became devastation. Better to trust the cold safety of solitude than risk being shattered again. But late at night, when the city outside his window flickered with life, he found himself whispering questions into the empty room. Was she laughing at me like Victoria once did? Or had I just driven away the only person who saw me as more than the empire I built on the other side of the city? Clara sat in her office long after her staff had gone home. She stared at the light installation she had once shown Alexander, the one that reacted to brainwaves. Tonight, when she slipped the sensor band onto her head, the sculpture flickered weakly, the patterns fractured, dim. She removed it with trembling hands, whispering into the empty gallery, "You asked me to let you in, Alexander, and I did, but you shut me out when I needed you most." Her voice cracked, and for the first time since their paths had crossed, Clara Bennett felt truly alone. The Winter Gala at Denver's historic Belmont Hotel was one of the most anticipated events of the season. Crystal chandeliers bathed the ballroom in golden light, and the city's elite gathered in glittering gowns and sharp tuxedos. Alexander Grant arrived as expected, calm, polished, distant. On his arm that night was Clara Bennett, radiant in an emerald gown that seemed to catch and hold the light. Whispers followed them the moment they entered. Some murmured admiration, others suspicion, still others sharpened their curiosity like knives. Clara kept her chin high, her hand resting gently on Alex's arm, a steady anchor against the tide of stares. The evening moved smoothly at first, music from a string quartet, polite conversations about art and philanthropy, speeches about the hospital wing being funded by donations, but storms rarely announced themselves in advance. When Victoria Hale appeared, the atmosphere shifted. She glided across the marble floor in a gown of icy silver, her smile polished to perfection. The crowd seemed to part for her as she approached Alexander and Clara. "Well," Victoria said sweetly, her voice carrying farther than necessary, "if it isn't Denver's most elusive bachelor, finally tamed by, what was it, a curator?" She gave a delicate laugh, the kind designed to wound. "Tell me, Alex, is this truly love, or just another project to distract from what you can't provide?" The words landed like stones. A hush fell across the ballroom. Conversations stilled. Champagne glasses froze mid-air. Everyone knew exactly what she meant. Old rumors, long buried, stirred again like embers catching flame. Alexander's jaw tightened. His instinct was to retreat behind silence, as he had for years, to let the whispers swirl while he built taller walls. But before he could speak, Clara stepped forward. Her voice was steady, clear, and rang out across the hall. "You're mistaken, Miss Hale." Victoria's eyes flickered, surprised by the interruption. Clara continued, her words sharp but dignified. "Alexander Grant does not need to prove himself to anyone. Not to this city, not to this ballroom, and certainly not to you. The empire he's built speaks for itself. The generosity he's shown has changed lives. But beyond all of that, he is a man of integrity, strength, and heart. I know because I've seen him, not the headlines, not the gossip, but the human being. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Clara's cheeks flushed, but her gaze never wavered. So, if you want to shame him for what you call his defects, you'll have to go through me first. And I assure you, Miss Hale, I don't break so easily. Silence, pure, electric silence. Alexander turned toward her, something inside him unraveling. For years, he had carried the weight of humiliation alone. For years, he had stood against whispers with no one at his side. And now, here was Clara, fierce and unflinching, placing herself between him and the storm. Emotion surged in his chest, grief, gratitude, love, until he could no longer contain it. He reached for Clara's hand, held it firmly, and with a voice that carried across the ballroom, he said the words that had been burning inside him for weeks. "I love her." The declaration rang out, simple and undeniable. Gasps echoed. The silence stretched, and then, as if a spell had broken, applause rose, first tentative, then swelling, until the entire ballroom filled with the sound. Men and women stood, clapping, some smiling, some wiping at their eyes. Alexander and Clara stood together in the center of it all, their hands joined, their heads high. Victoria's face tightened, the icy mask cracking. For the first time, she looked small, not the queen of whispers, but a woman suddenly irrelevant in a room that no longer applauded her cruelty. With stiff grace, she turned and slipped away, her departure noted but uncelebrated. Alexander leaned close to Clara, his voice trembling with emotion. "You saved me tonight." Clara squeezed his hand. "No, Alex, you saved yourself. I just reminded you of who you are." For the first time in years, Alexander felt the weight lift. The crowd still applauded, but it no longer mattered. The only truth was the woman beside him, her strength woven with his vulnerability, their bond forged not in secrecy, but in light. And as the ovation thundered around them, Alexander realized this was no longer just about survival. It was about love, real, defiant, enduring. The weeks following the gala felt different, as though a veil had finally lifted from Alexander Grant's life. For the first time in years, he no longer walked into a room bracing for whispers. The city's chatter shifted from scandal and suspicion to admiration for the man who had spoken his heart so openly. But for Alexander, the applause didn't matter. What mattered was the quiet that followed. The quiet of evenings spent with Clara, laughter spilling into the corners of his penthouse. The quiet of mornings where she brewed coffee while he read the paper. Their lives blending into something that felt startlingly ordinary. And for a man who had lived behind walls of steel and glass, ordinary felt like a miracle. One evening, after a long day at the museum, Clara came over with a bottle of red wine and two mismatched mugs she'd forgotten glasses. And Alexander had smiled, saying he preferred it that way. They sat on the balcony, the city shimmering below, the air cool but not yet touched by winter's bite. Clara curled against him, her head on his shoulder, as he wrapped an arm around her. For the first time, Alexander felt not the weight of expectation, but the ease of belonging. That night, when he finally drifted into sleep beside her, his mind conjured a dream he hadn't allowed in years. He was standing in a sunlit garden, laughter echoing around him. A child ran across the grass, a little boy with auburn hair like Clara's, his tiny hand reaching out, his smile wide and unguarded. The boy ran to Alexander, calling him Dad, and Alexander scooped him up, the joy of that simple word overwhelming his heart. Clara stood nearby, her eyes radiant with love, watching them as though the world had finally set itself right. The dream was so vivid, so achingly tender, that when Alexander woke, his chest ached with longing. He lay still for a moment, listening to Clara's steady breathing beside him, her hand resting lightly over his heart. When she stirred awake, she found him staring at the ceiling, his expression caught somewhere between wonder and pain. "Bad dream?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "No, the opposite." Clara propped herself on one elbow, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Tell me." He hesitated. Vulnerability still felt foreign, even with her. But if there was anyone he could trust with the fragile truth, it was Clara. I dreamed of a child. His voice faltered. Our child. He was laughing, running across a garden. He called me Dad. Clara's eyes softened, but she stayed silent, letting him continue. I woke up, and for a moment, it felt real. And then, he swallowed hard, looking away. Then I remembered who I am, what I can't give, and it felt like losing something all over again. His words hung heavy in the room. For a man who had built an empire, admitting powerlessness was like tearing open his own armor. Clara reached out, gently cupping his face in her hands. Alexander, look at me. He turned, his eyes clouded with shame. You are not defined by what others say you lack, she whispered. Not by Victoria, not by the whispers, not even by medicine. You are defined by the love you're willing to give, and that love, it's more than enough. He closed his eyes, fighting the sting of tears. But what if I can't give you what you deserve? What if you wake up one day and realize I've cheated you out of the life you want? Clara leaned closer, pressing her forehead against his. What I want is you. Not perfection, not guarantees. You. If children come, we'll celebrate. If they don't, we'll still build a life full of love and meaning. Either way, we'll face it together. Her words washed over him like balm, soothing the wound he had carried for so long. But still, the dream lingered in his heart, the boy's laughter, the word Dad ringing in his ears. Clara must have sensed it, because she pulled him fully into her embrace, her voice steady and sure. Let's try, Alex, let's believe. Don't bury this dream before it has a chance to live. For a long moment, Alexander said nothing. He simply held her, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest. The thought of hoping again terrified him, but for the first time in years, the terror felt worth facing. Finally, he whispered back, almost inaudible, let's believe. Outside, the city glowed as it always had, but inside, in the quiet of that room, something new had been born. Not certainty, not promises. Hope, the decision, once spoken aloud, became a weight they both carried together. Within a week, Alexander and Clara sat in a quiet clinic tucked just outside the bustle of downtown Denver, far from the boardrooms and galleries that usually filled their days. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender candles, as though the staff had tried to soften the clinical edge with gentleness. For Alexander, the air felt heavier than any courtroom or investor meeting he had ever walked into. Here, he had no control, no leverage, only hope and the fear that it might betray him. Dr. Reynolds, a calm woman with silver hair and kind eyes, greeted them warmly. Infertility is a word that carries shame, she said, looking at Alexander as though she already knew the shadow he bore. But it should never carry blame. We'll take this one step at a time. Step by step became blood tests, ultrasounds, endless paperwork, and schedules that carved their lives into cycles and counts. Clara endured hormone injections that left her tired and achy, while Alexander sat beside her, wincing each time the needle pierced her skin. He offered to take the pain for her if he could. She only smiled and squeezed his hand. Some days, the strain was palpable. Alexander would pace the length of his penthouse at 3 a.m, his mind filled with numbers, percentages, probabilities, failure rates. He hated numbers now. They had once been his fortress, but here they felt like enemies. Clara would find him, drape a blanket around his shoulders, and lead him back to bed, whispering, one day at a time. Other days, the journey held unexpected tenderness. Clara began sketching during the long hours in waiting rooms, small doodles of the nurses bustling about, of Alexander's furrowed brow as he read through medical pamphlets, even of the vending machine that became their reluctant companion. Alexander, who rarely read fiction, began picking up novels, his voice filling the silence as he read aloud, while Clara rested her head against his shoulder. One afternoon, as the nurse drew blood for yet another test, Alexander caught Clara studying him with quiet amusement. What he asked? You, she said softly. The man who negotiates billion-dollar deals is sitting here reading me Pride and Prejudice in a fertility clinic. He smirked. Don't mock. Darcy has depth. Clara laughed, the sound breaking through the sterile air. And for a moment, the clinic became not a place of fear, but of life shared fragile, imperfect, beautiful. Still, doubt gnawed at Alexander. At night, when Clara fell asleep, he stared at the ceiling, hearing Victoria's voice like an echo in the dark. Defective. Can't give me children. No matter how many times Clara reassured him, the memory clung, whispering that he was leading her into disappointment. One evening, as he tucked the blanket around Clara while she dozed after another round of treatment, the words spilled out, low and raw. What if I fail you? Clara's eyes fluttered open. She reached for his hand, her grip weak but steady. Then we fail together. But Alex's failure isn't the same as worth. You're not defined by outcomes. You're defined by love, and that you've never failed me in. Her words steadied him, yet the battle inside raged. Each procedure carried both hope and heartbreak. Each calendar date circled in red became a milestone he dreaded as much as he longed for. During one particularly grueling cycle, when the injections left Clara pale and fatigued, Alexander insisted they escape the city for a weekend. They drove into the Rockies, staying in a small cabin where the air smelled of pine and the stars burned brighter than city lights ever could. There, they found small moments of reprieve. Clara sketched the mountains while Alexander built a fire, the two of them wrapped in blankets with mugs of cocoa. The silence was not heavy, but healing. At night, beneath the vast sky, Alexander held her close and whispered, "If this doesn't work, I'll still thank God for the gift of you." Clara kissed his cheek, her eyes shining. Then let's keep walking until we find the gift we're meant to hold. Back in Denver, the tests resumed, the schedules resumed, and the waiting resumed. Yet Alexander began to see the journey differently. It was no longer only about conquering biology. It was about learning to hope again, to sit in uncertainty without surrendering to despair. Still, in his quietest moments, the old fear whispered, "What if I dream too much? What if it all shatters again?" And in those moments, Clara would reach for his hand, grounding him with the steady truth of her presence. They were tired, they were frightened, but they were together. And for the first time, Alexander realized that even in the trial itself, there was a kind of miracle, because brokenness had once driven him into isolation. But now, it was teaching him how to love, not despite fear, but through it. The call came on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Clara had gone alone to her appointment, insisting Alexander stay at the office for a board meeting he couldn't postpone. He had barely settled into his leather chair when his phone buzzed. Her voice was trembling, half laughter, half tears. "Alex, it worked. I'm pregnant." For a moment, Alexander couldn't breathe. The boardroom faded, the polished table, the graphs on the screen, the murmurs of his executives all dissolved into silence. He rose from his chair, stepping out into the hallway, gripping the phone as though it were the only thing tethering him to reality. "Say it again," he whispered. Clara's laughter broke through, fragile but radiant. "We're going to have a baby." The words struck him like sunlight piercing a storm. For months, they had lived on cycles, tests, disappointment, and fragile hope. Now, in one breath, the impossible had become real. His eyes burned, and though he tried to steady his voice, it cracked with emotion. "Clara, you've just given me the world." That evening, they sat together in her apartment, hands clasped over the tiny sonogram photo that already felt like a miracle. Alexander traced the grainy outline with his finger, his chest tight with awe. "This is us," he murmured. "This is our hope." But miracles rarely come without shadows. Weeks later, Clara's doctor frowned during a routine checkup. "There are complications," she explained gently. "The pregnancy is viable, but high risk. Clara will need close monitoring and significant rest. Stress must be kept to a minimum." The words fell heavy in the room. Clara tried to stay composed, but Alexander's heart thundered in his chest. All his old fears returned in a rush loss. Failure. The crushing weight of helplessness. On the drive home, he gripped the wheel too tightly, his jaw clenched. "I should have been there," he muttered. "I should have done more, protected you. Protected Alex." Clara's hand rested on his arm. "This isn't something you can fix with willpower or money. We can only walk it, one day at a time, together." Her calm steadied him. But at night, when she slept, Alexander lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The thought of losing her, or the life they had fought so hard to create, gnawed at him. For a man who had built his empire on control, surrendering to uncertainty was a torment he didn't know how to bear. And yet, day by day, he learned to sit through hours of hospital monitoring, his hand wrapped around hers, reading aloud the same novels they had once shared in waiting rooms. He learned to cook simple meals, fumbling through recipes with far less grace than his business ventures, earning Clara's laughter when he burned toast or oversalted soup. He learned that love was not only in grand declarations, but in the quiet constancy of showing up, even when fear whispered he might not be enough. One evening, as they sat on her couch, Clara sketching idly while Alexander read beside her, she looked up and caught him watching her with that far-away look he sometimes wore. What she asked, smiling softly. He closed the book, voice low. "I'm terrified. Clara, every time I see you wince, every time the doctor frowns, I feel like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way." Clara set down her pencil, shifting closer. She took his face in her hands, her eyes steady. "Then don't stand on the edge alone. Stand with me. If we fall together. But if we fly, Alex, we'll fly because we dared to hold on." Her words broke something open in him. For the first time, he allowed himself to cry openly, not the silent tears of shame or anger, but the raw sobs of a man who had carried too much for too long. Clara held him, rocking gently, whispering over and over, "We'll make it. We'll make it." In the weeks that followed, their lives became a rhythm of hospital visits, whispered prayers, and small victories. Each clear heartbeat on the monitor was a triumph. Each week that passed without new complications felt like another brick in the fragile bridge they were building toward the future. One night, as the first snow of the season fell outside, Clara placed Alexander's hand on her belly. Beneath his palm, faint but undeniable, was movement. He froze, eyes wide, tears welling instantly. "I felt it," he whispered. "Clara, I felt our baby." Her smile glowed brighter than the snow outside. "See, even in the storms, life finds a way." Alexander bent his head, pressing his lips to her stomach, whispering words he hadn't dared speak aloud until then. "You are my miracle, both of you." And in that moment, he understood miracles weren't about perfection. They were about faith that carried you through fear, love that refused to surrender, and hope that refused to die, even when the odds said otherwise. The hospital room was hushed except for the rhythmic beeping of monitors and Clara's steady, labored breaths. Snow drifted outside the tall windows of Denver Memorial, a gentle storm cloaking the city in white. Inside, the storm was different pain and effort, hope and fear colliding in each contraction. Alexander Grant stood at her side, his hands trembling though he tried to steady them. His usual composure, the armor that had carried him through decades of boardrooms and battles, was gone. In its place was a man stripped bare, clinging to the woman who had taught him how to love again. "You're almost there, Clara, Doctor," Reynolds said calmly, her voice like a lifeline. One more push. Clara's face contorted with effort, her knuckles white as she gripped Alex's hand. He bent close, whispering into her ear, his voice breaking. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever known. I'm right here, always. And then a cry, a fierce, defiant cry that filled the room like music. The doctor lifted a tiny, squirming bundle and announced, "A healthy baby girl." For a moment, Alex couldn't move. The sound, the sight, the sheer miracle of it overwhelmed him. When the nurse placed the baby in Clara's arms, Alex's knees nearly buckled. Clara looked up at him, her face radiant despite exhaustion. "Meet her," she whispered. Alexander reached out, his hands shaking as he cradled his daughter for the first time. She was impossibly small, her skin soft, her fists clenched as if ready to take on the world. A head of dark hair framed her perfect face. His vision blurred, tears slid freely down his cheeks, and he didn't care who saw. He bent close, his voice raw, a confession decades in the making. "I thought I was broken," he whispered to the tiny life in his arms. "But you made me whole." Clara reached for him, her hand resting over his. Together they gazed at their daughter, the embodiment of every prayer, every sleepless night, every act of faith. They named her Grace Evelyn Grant. Grace Boehm for the gift she was, and Evelyn, after Clara's grandmother, who had once told her that light could be found in the darkest night. 2 months later, the city gathered again, this time at the Denver Museum of Modern Art. The gala was alive with light and music, a celebration not of opulence but of resilience. At the center stood the Grant family Alexander, Clara, and baby Grace, who slept peacefully in her mother's arms beneath a cascade of soft crystal chandeliers. The press was everywhere, but for once, Alex didn't care about the whispers, the flashbulbs, or the endless speculation. Tonight was not about appearances. Tonight was about legacy. Maggie, loyal as ever, introduced them from the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we are honored to unveil the Grant Bennett Foundation, dedicated to supporting families who, like Alex and Clara, have walked the difficult road of infertility." Polite applause rose from the crowd, but it quieted as Alexander himself stepped forward to the microphone. For a moment, he simply looked at Clara, who nodded encouragingly, her eyes shining. Then he began, "I've spent most of my life believing that success meant control, that if I built high enough walls, accumulated enough victories, I could keep out pain. But 5 years ago, I learned that even the strongest walls can crumble when someone you trust betrays you. I thought I was finished, defeated." His voice wavered, but he pressed on, and then, "Clara walked into my life. She didn't see a broken man. She saw possibilities. Together we faced trials I would have once called impossible. Tonight, I hold in my arms proof that love does not bend to statistics or shame. Our daughter, Grace, is living light." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience as Clara stepped forward beside him, placing a hand over his. He smiled faintly, gathering his courage. "This foundation will fund not only advanced medical treatments, but also emotional and community support, because no couple should ever face despair alone. Love is not about perfection. It's about believing in possibilities when the world says otherwise." The room fell silent, and then, one by one, people rose to their feet. Applause swelled, rolling like thunder through the hall. Some clapped with dignity, others with tears streaming down their faces. From the corner, Victoria Hale, once the ghost of Alex's past, watched quietly. She had slipped in unnoticed, her usual sharpness dimmed. For the first time, she seemed smaller, almost human. She saw him now, not as the man she had mocked, but as a father, a partner, whole in ways she had never imagined. Without a word, she turned and left, her heels clicking softly against marble floors, her shadow dissolving into the night. Later, when the speeches were over and the crowd had thinned, Alexander and Clara stepped outside onto the museum balcony. The city sprawled below, glowing in the winter night. Clara rocked Grace gently, her lullaby barely above a whisper. Alex wrapped an arm around them both, his heart full to bursting. He had once looked at this city and seen only glass towers and empty victories. Now, He saw promised life unfolding in ways he had never dared to dream. He pressed his lips to Clara's temple, then to Grace's tiny head. "This," he murmured, "is my masterpiece." Clara smiled, leaning into him. "No, Alex, this is ours." The snow continued to fall, soft and steady, blanketing the city in quiet light. And for the first time in a lifetime, Alexander Grant felt complete not because of his empire, but because of the fragile, luminous family in his arms. A family of light. At its heart, Alexander and Clara's story is not just about love, it's about courage. Courage to face the wounds of the past, to admit vulnerability, and to believe in possibilities when the world insists otherwise. Many of us, especially as we grow older, know what it means to carry hidden scars, disappointments, betrayals, or dreams left unfulfilled. It is tempting to protect ourselves by building walls, but walls keep out joy as much as they keep out pain. This story reminds us that true strength is not found in perfection, but in perseverance. Love is not about avoiding flaws, but about choosing to see beauty even in brokenness. Alexander believed he was incomplete, yet Clara saw wholeness where he only saw failure. And in time, that vision became his own. For those watching, perhaps the lesson is this: it is never too late to open your heart. Healing can come in unexpected ways, and love, whether romantic, familial, or through friendship, has the power to transform the darkest chapters into new beginnings. So, let us live with faith in possibilities, even when the odds seem impossible. After all, sometimes the greatest miracles grow from the places we once thought were barren. Thank you so much for spending your time with us and walking through this story of love, resilience, and hope. If it touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who might need encouragement, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue bringing you more stories that inspire, heal, and remind us all of the power of love.